Hello, booktube. My name's Alex Banks. Welcome to the very first episode of Books with Banks. I love talking about fantasy fiction, and my favorite fantasy series of all time is the Malazan Book of the Fallen and the other sub-series in the Malazan world created jointly by Ian Cameron Esselmont and Steven Erikson. Today, for this, my first video, I thought I'd go through and do a quick ranking of the 13 novels that Steven Erikson has written in this universe. To be clear, for those of you who aren't as familiar with the structure of all things Malazan, there is one first official main 10-novel series called The Malazan Book of the Fallen, and that was written by Steven Erikson. Then Mr. Erikson has also written and published 7 additional dark humor, extremely dark and gory, but extremely goofy, humorous novellas called the Balcolin and Corbel Broach novellas. He's written one short story that is kind of tied into the Malazan world, Malazan universe. It could exist in it. It doesn't really need to, though. And then Mr. Erikson has also written the first novel in a sequel trilogy to his main 10-book series, and the first 2 novels in a prequel trilogy to his main 10-book series. In addition to all of that, his friend, Mr. Esselmont, has written his sort of main 6-book series called Novels of the Malazan Empire. He's also written 3 prequel novels as well. For today's video, we're just going to be focusing on, as I said at the beginning, specifically the 13 novels that Steven Erikson has written. I might do a video later ranking or going through all of Esselmont's contributions. In fact, I could maybe eventually do a big, long kind of joint ranking. However, the way that I read things in the first place, I gave Steven Erikson a bit of an unfair advantage reading so much of his stuff before I went into any Esselmont stuff, and then I was jumping back and forth, and just by comparison, in that first read through of a lot of that stuff, I was much more eager to just get back to Steven Erikson stuff, and not as excited when I saw next in the chronological reading order or publication order that it was an Esselmont book coming up next. So I do think if I had waited and maybe separated reading those series more, that the rankings would be more mixed, whereas right now I would probably rank most of Steven Erikson's books above or better than Ian Esselmont's books. And again, I don't really think that's because of any difference in the skill of either author or the quality of those stories. I think it mostly has to do with the order that I read the books in. There won't be any heavy spoilers. I might allude to an exciting situation that happens around the middle of a book, and so what will be spoiled is that something big happens in the middle of a book. Instead of at the end where you might expect, but I won't go into specifics. I won't talk anything about character deaths. Okay, so without any further ado, in 13th place, I have Gardens of the Moon, the first book by Mr. Steven Erikson, in the Malazan Book of the Fallen. Now, this book does get a little bit of criticism. I actually think it's weird for me to say this. I think it's underrated, even though I have it ranked 13th on a list of 13 books. But I think this is a really great introduction to how crazy and insane a lot of this world gets. In this book, Mr. Erikson focuses a lot on deconstructing tropes and common patterns in fantasy fiction, but then from there, what is built in place of what was deconstructed seems a little bit jumbled in parts to me. Particularly the conclusion is that there's a lot of moving pieces. It's a little bit hard to follow along. Everything there's a big party in the end, and just everything that goes down there, it can be a little hard to follow along, because we don't really understand the magic. To be fair, a lot of the characters in the world don't either, so they are as confused as we are. And I think that might just be a little bit of a rocky way to start the series, by building to this small first novel's ending conclusion. That's pretty epic, pretty exciting, but a little confusing. Introduces some great characters, although I think the way that he does a lot of his character work is, it's sort of like meeting people in the real world, where you don't know that much about them at first, because no one's saying, yes, this person has all of this list of amazing qualities, and this is why you should love them. It's more like you grow to really like or really dislike them, for the most part. That's how his character writing works. And I think it's a very realistic, organic way to write characters, but because of that, like, nobody's favorite memories of their times with their best friends are the first week they ever met them, which is like this book, right? Really great. A lot of fun stuff. I love everything with a certain marionette in this book. I love everything with the sword that's introduced here, how it's introduced here. Yeah, but 13th place. Now, next, this is actually the most recent novel that Mr. Erikson has had published, and again, it stinks to rank some of these things so lowly. This is one of the more recent books that I've read of his, not the most, but pretty close, and we have The God Is Not Willing, Book 1 in the Witness Trilogy. This is the sequel trilogy to that main 10-book Malazan Book of the Fallen, of which Garnets of the Moon was the first volume. This is the first of the sequel trilogy, and it is a fascinating jumping-off point. It's really two stories, two very different types of stories, I think, sort of all circling around and building towards a kind of a disastrous event, to be as vague as possible. And one of those stories covers a lot of very serious things, things like grief and trauma and survivor's guilt. It covers things like family conflict, covers things like self-harm and growing up, really. The absence of parental figures. Covers things like guilt of past crimes. And that's a very powerful thread in this. The two characters there are Rant and Damask, are the two most important. And both are written very well. Interesting exploration of certain fantastical elements of this world that we hadn't really seen. And this is about 10 years or so after the main 10 books finish up. So there's a bit of time, a bit of a distance there. So on the less heavy side of things, the other half of the story, it's all about soldiers, Marines, some of which might be magical, but I don't want to say too much about that. And it is hilarious. This is some of the funniest stuff in here that I have read in any fantasy I've ever read is in this book, which is wonderful how it can be contrasted with all of the kind of darker things that are going on with the other half of the storyline. And I think what I do really like about this book is its smaller scope, smaller cast of characters, still a lot of characters, but it's a smaller cast than we're used to with Erikson, and it doesn't rely too heavily on those, I remember that thing from those other books. Like sequels sometimes do. It's not like, oh yay, like we get to see all our old friends again. We barely get to see any of our old friends again, and I think that's great. Still though, I think there are other things in the main 10 books and other stuff that he's written that I'm a little bit more connected to, and that make I guess I just find a little bit more compelling. So this is going to sit in 12th place. However, part of that could be that this is the first in a trilogy, and I don't know where the second or third book are going to take things. So those could either elevate or drop this one, probably by association. We'll just have to wait and see where this story goes. I will also say, compared to his other work that isn't the main 10 book series, the prequel trilogy, this is the sequel trilogy, he's got the prequel trilogy, I'm more looking forward to what comes next of this sequel trilogy, or of the prequel trilogy, than of this one. So that might sort of hurt this one's ranking just a little bit. Now, in 11th place, I don't even remember what I put here. Okay, yeah, we've got House of Chains, which is the 4th book in the main 10-volume series, the Book of the Fallen series. And this is actually very much connected to God Is Not Willing, that sequel book, even though I think the humor in that one and the divide of comedy and harsh realities is kind of a lot more like book 9 from the main 10. We'll get to that shortly. But this is book 4, which sets up, long before that sequel series, a lot of what is being dealt with in that sequel series. And the first fourth of this book is all one character's backstory, and I think it is brilliantly done. Pretty polarizing character. I don't like him, but I like how he's written, and I enjoy what Erikson did with him in this book. Not even so much that backstory part, but then once the rest of the story continues on from where books 1, 2, and 3 left off, that character is still in it. He's just not the main character anymore, but the growth that he still has to experience throughout the rest, it's still very fascinating. Still one of the best parts of this book. There's one particular army or group or camp that is sort of the more religious focused group, and I found the questions and things that are being grappled with there very compelling, really exciting. There's not a lot of momentum or excitement, I guess, building towards their part to play in the eventual conflict here, but I found that very, very interesting. The other side, the army that is kind of marching towards that group, we're introduced to a lot of new characters who I'll grow to love, so similar to Book 1, Guardians of the Moon, characters I'll learn to love and I'll fall in love with, but at their inception aren't my favorites, they do interesting things, and I'm curious about them, and I'm curious to see where they go, but it's just in this book not the height of how much I like them. Also, we get introduced to characters like Onrak and Troll, and their adventure is very fascinating, and Troll was such a unique mystery to me, and I was so excited to see where we went with his character from here, or look back at his character, other things that he may have done and gone through. And then Crocus and Absalar. I've never been the biggest fan of either of these characters. They're both in this book quite a bit, and their adventure they go on touches on a lot of lore stuff, and in and of itself, in this book, I was not super intrigued by that, even though it's very important for what happens in the rest of the series and in other series, things that are alluded to lore-wise and as building out the pantheon and figuring out exactly what the goals of the gods are. But when you're reading this book for the first time, it's kind of hard to piece all of that together. Right here, just with this one. End of the day, this introduces and fleshes out a lot of great characters, and does a lot of heavy lifting, I think, moving pieces around on the board, getting things set up for the main narrative thrust of the rest of the Book of the Fallen. So that's book 4. I've got that ranked in 11th place. Now in 10th place, we're gonna have The Crippled God. Book 10 of Book of the Fallen, the finale, the concluding chapter. I love this. I love how he ends the series. I should say now, though, that typically, not just with this series, but with anything else, any movie franchise or whatever, TV show, I don't love the first the first season, the first movie, the first book as much, and then I really start to like it in the middle, and then at the end it always kind of tails off for me in my preference. I just really like the mounting tension middle parts of series. All that stuff, that excitement that's happening in the middle where there's still enough room for anything to happen, in anything crazy to happen, and predictions to be made for where things are going in the back half, but you also have all of this rich history and this rich time that you've spent with the characters. So I think it's just, I rank this in 10th place, not because it's a bad conclusion. I think it's a phenomenal conclusion. I'm just not the biggest fan of conclusions or beginnings, especially in such long series. There are some storylines that, while I like them, like the Shake and some of getting introduced to, or continuing on from Dust of Dreams and the introduction of things like the Grey Helm storyline, other cultures and peoples, their war kind of politics going on in Eastern Lether, that on that continent. It's all very interesting stuff. However, it pulls some attention away from the characters that I was really invested in and had been invested in for most of the series. And so, yeah, I think I'm really just ranking this so low because of my typical love of the middle section of longer series, things like that. But there are a few things that make me like this one just a little less. I'm also never been the biggest big battle fan. I like them fine, but a big climactic finale doesn't necessarily win me over. So I think me ranking this in 10th place here is a pretty good example of that, because this has some of the most amazing, epic, big, climactic finale kind of scenes imaginable. So yeah, please, if you're looking to get into the series, don't let this discourage you and make you think, oh no, the final book was ranked so low. It really is amazing, and yeah, an amazing conclusion to an amazing, massive 10-volume series. So now in 9th place, we have a book, and this might be one of my more controversial picks. I think this is a lot of people's favorite. But in 9th place, we have Memories of Ice, Book 3. I love the Mahayab storyline. I love the introductions to both Gruntle and Ikovian here. Both fascinating characters in their own ways. Was honestly never the biggest fan of the Lady Envy stuff, even though I like the talk end of things. The Lady Envy part never quite did it for me. I think this is one of the few that I have reread, and I think there's a lot of setting things up again, making sure we're comfortable, making sure we remember who the bridge burners are, making sure we understand exactly what's going on with Silver Fox, who is a bit of a weird character. the idea of her is interesting, and I like her for the Mahib storyline, but I don't necessarily like love scenes that Silver Fox is in, if that makes any sense. And then I think a big reason that knocks this book down so low for me, and I mean, we're already nearing the middle of the list, so it's not super low. Still, I mean, it has an amazing siege, and amazing other parts too. Introduction of certain races, but I feel like there is a pretty morally just bad antagonist here, and I prefer the more morally complex antagonist. I also think I like the bridge burners, and I start to like them more here than I did in the previous two books. However, I don't like that group as much as the Bonehunters, because the Bonehunter group of soldiers, that group is the one that we are along, the readers are along for their inception, their whole ride, their whole experience, the forming, all of those moments that really bring them together, bring us, the reader, into that unit, sort of. Whereas the bridge burners, they're old, they've been through it all, they're veterans, basically, and so I like them, and I do start to like them more here than I did previously. But they're not among my favorite characters. But yeah, again, love the Gruntle storyline. Love the Akovian storyline. I like aspects of the fantastic aspects that get explored here. Introduction of the Barghest. I guess Barghest are mentioned and alluded to, and there is at least one Barghest character in Guardians of the Moon, but that culture is looked at a little bit more deeply here. All great stuff. Interesting stuff with the Pantheon really starts here. The main series antagonist, I guess we could call that person, really gets introduced here. Yeah, great book. A few things that hold it down this low in 9th place for me. Next up, we a few spots ago just talked about part 2 of the conclusion. This is part 1 of the conclusion, book 9 in Malazan, Book of the Fallen. I think I like the building mounting tension here a lot. I love the conclusion. I love the exploration of a certain character dealing with, shall we say, ghosts of the past. Not even necessarily his past in some cases. Just sort of, it's a very spiritual side story that's really fascinating here. This is some of the most heartbreaking stuff with the snake and everything going on with one specific culture that I don't want to say for spoilers. But something happens to a character that is probably thought of by most fans as the most brutal thing that happens in the series. And it's really tough to read, but it shines a light on some horrible aspects of cultures that exist in the real world. It just so happens that this is taking place in a fantasy world. And I think it's a really interesting context to explore the results of something like that, the ramifications of that. This also has some stuff that takes place in Letheris, which is maybe my second favorite city location in the entire series, with how, by this point in the series, who's running things in Letheris. I really enjoy all of that. I love all of the amazing amount of page time we get with our group of Bonehunters characters in here. I think that absolutely elevates this book quite a bit. But yeah, still not quite in the middle of the pack, almost there. But yeah, so I've got this ranked in 8th place. Now, middle of the road, the kind of main, not the highest highs, not the lowest lows of the series. We've got Book 2, Book of the Fallen, Deadhouse Gates. Deadhouse Gates really propelled me into the series. Guardians of the Moon, I ranked it 13th place. Got me interested. I was very intrigued. I was excited to keep going. This one made me... I was probably halfway through, maybe 2/3 through, something like that, of this book. And I went out and I had to buy the rest of the series and all of S1's stuff. And I just... This is really where I fell in love with the series, and I knew I was in it for the long haul. And it is a long haul, especially to commit so early in it, with just the second book. But that's the power of this book. It's so good. I've reread this one. I think while it was my favorite storyline the first time through, I like even more this time through the Felician story. And if you know, you know, and I love that storyline, and it made me cry, and just thinking about it I get a little emotional. So yes, if anyone out there is watching this and you haven't read Malazan Book of the Fallen, please give it a try through this book. I do think the beginning has a little bit of the jumbled, like, unsure footing kind of feeling that the first book, that Guardians of the Moon had. But by the time you get into, like, most of these are broken into 4 parts, 4 books. When you get partway through the 3rd book in this one, you should be pretty comfortable and pretty much set in for the ride, at least with this book. And as I mentioned, even though I put Memories of Ice a little lower than this, the 3rd book, a lot of people like that one more and think that's really one of the big peaks of the series. But yeah, so this is amazing, and I love this book. Little messy at the start, or felt a little messy to me. A little jarring, I think, to jump to an entirely new continent with barely any of the characters from Guardians of the Moon. But I like pretty much most of this cast more than, at this point in time, more than a lot of the people we met in Guardians of the Moon. So that's why I put this in 7th place, exactly the middle point in this ranking. Okay. Gotta take a breath. So next we have I think it's gonna be a controversial choice. I'm putting in the 6th place. This is the most recent novel I've read in this universe, and I love it. So far, it's my book of the year. It's my book of 2022, one of my favorite book of 2022 that I've read, and that is Fall of Light, Book 2 of the Carcanis prequel trilogy. Now, Carcanis is a complicated series to talk about, I think. I don't see a ton of coverage on this series on booktube, or even specifically MalazTube. I don't see a ton of coverage. I know Niflrog has an apology video about the series, sort of defending its merits. And I highly recommend everyone go check that out. I know Dr. Philip Chase on his channel, he has done reviews of both book 1 in this series and this book. That's Forge of Darkness, book 1, and Fall of Light right here. However, a big reason why I'm starting a booktube channel is if and when the 3rd volume in this trilogy comes out, I really kind of want to ramp up, or help ramp up, excitement and get more people invested in this prequel trilogy. That can be a little bit difficult because I would say the prerequisite is reading at least all 10 books in Book of the Fallen first, And then these two books, Forge of Darkness and Fall of Light, even if they were just a series on their own, they're dense, heavily philosophical, a lot of internal monologue, a lot of people grappling with choices they've made, choices they're going to make, what this means for their mortal soul, what this means for the world, for society, what civilizations look like, what their particular profession, if it really fits in a civil war setting. I love all of this. However, I can understand why some people might not like a lot of this more kind of deep thinking, less action focused, I'd say even less dialogue based. There is dialogue, but there's a lot more internal monologue. And it is, I think, there's some extremely powerful stuff in here. I will say this is ranked 6th and not any higher, just because similar to The God Is Not Willing, book 1 of the sequel trilogy, not sure where that final volume is going to take things. And so far with this one, there were a couple characters, 2 younger adults, teenagers or younger adults, that were traveling with the parent figure at least to a location in the first book here. In this book, they're there, and they just kind of hang out for the whole book. And while that was one of my favorite parts of the first book in this trilogy, and their sort of adventuring and conversations with those parental figures gave a lot of great insight into how they're growing up, how they're being raised, how they're going to see the world. For them to for this book, such a big book, to just hang around and not do much, it's kind of like, oh, okay, whatever. However, this book introduces some amazing stuff, particularly everything with the Hust Legion, dealing with cowardice and grief from battle and sorrow for the soldiers and pity for the soldiers. It's also some of the funniest stuff, but like really smart humor. It's not goofy, grotesque, like some of Erikson's novella humor is. The stuff in here, there's 2 characters named Prazik and Dathanar here that I don't think if I remember right, they're not in the first one, or they're maybe just like mentioned in passing, but they get a lot of page time, or a lot more page time here, and they're great. They're an absolute pleasure to read. Last but not least, the way that this book wraps up, sure, there's sort of a big twist kind of thing at the end, but even before that, everything's building to a climax, and the way that Erikson chooses to describe the climax and deliver the climax to us here is so beautiful, and it just really makes you think about violence and history, and the telling of history and the telling of stories, the narrativization of violence and history in such a fascinating way. And I have a couple degrees in history. I'm trained as an historian, so really to see a lot of the debates and some of these deeper thinking historical philosophies and theories kind of things brought to the fore, and to make me think about things that I haven't thought about since my history theory classes, or courses in grad school. It's just a pleasure, an absolute pleasure. And this book, on top of that, it's an amazing fantasy book. So 6th place, easily 6th, at least 6th place. We'll see if the final volume can elevate it at all. However, I'm not sure this ever will drop in my ranking. 6th. Okay, so now in 5th place, we have The Bonehunters, Book 6, in Malazan Book of the Fallen. Love this book. I think I will say the negatives first. Not the biggest fan of Mappo just hanging out reflecting on his life. I like the character, and I like once we're through that and we get to know more about him, I like that. I also, I don't necessarily like when, like, oh, some big bad monster has just been released and it's going to be a monster that we have to deal with in this book, and it's going to kind of cross between different storylines and the characters are going to deal with it, and that's all pretty much self-contained to this book, and I'm not sure it added too much to any character development. It seemed like just some action. Now, if I go back, maybe I can get a few more connections, and I can kind of see why that part of the story was essential. But yeah, just that monster. If you've read it, you probably know what I'm talking about. It was just, you know. But anyway, we're in my top 5. Steven Erikson, Malazan books. So that's really all the negative I have here. This does amazing work, basically picking up where book 4 left off. Not book 5, but book 4. Well, sort of picking up where both book 4 and book 5 left off. Egatan, if you've read through it, chapter 7, you know why it's difficult to think lowly of this book. That is just an amazing chapter, an amazing storytelling feat, what Mr. Erikson was able to do there. And then everything with the plague is interesting. Not my favorite stuff in the series, but still interesting. And then the conclusion. Well, first, there's a big kind of sort of climactic moment that happens when people are on ships. They see something. Different characters around the world see something happening sort of simultaneously. That's a beautiful scene, and I love that. Super mystical and really great stuff. We also get introduced to some new characters here, like Berthol and Samar Dev, Hellion here. Bottle becomes one of my favorites here. I love this book, and the conclusion is so suspenseful, so tense, so good, so good. 5th place, Bonehunters, book 6. And then in 4th place, I sort of talked about this book already, but this is book 1 in the Witness Trilogy, Forge of Darkness. I already talked about Fall of Light, and in doing so, I talked a little bit about what I like so much about just the series in general. I think this one is a little bit tighter. Every storyline seems to kind of interlink some way or another. I enjoy some of the Azathanai, or more demigod-like beings we get to interact with here, and you get that in the 2nd book, but there are a few in this one that don't really show up that much in the 2nd one that I really like them in this, or getting to see them at least in this, and their mindsets. I really like all of the suspense and tension building to a horrible thing. Just this pivotal moment in the history of the Andy people, and it's this something that should be joyous and exciting, and all of this horrible tension is just mounting, and you can feel this is not going to be good, and it's just getting closer and closer and closer, and it's the way he pulls it off is amazing, and it's heartbreaking, of course. This book also, I think, maybe more than any others, shows us several sort of situations with, like, parents, and what their responsibility is in raising children. how to instill in those children a sense of justice in an unjust world. What is justice after you just defeated an enemy that is blind to moral kind of gray areas, that really thinks in sort of absolutes? And then the paradigm shifts a little, and now one of the people that was helpful in defeating the self-righteous extreme, one of those factions, now sort of assumes that role as the most self-righteous extreme, even if they're not as, confident and arrogant in their convictions as the group that was defeated. They're still the thing that is the unit, the faction that thinks they are most just and most, I don't know, most right and most good, and just the way that that's explored, and how the gods interfere, and how they literally change things in the world to reflect the themes that Erikson is putting in the novels, in the series, but also the ways that people fear they're being perceived. It's just, there's some beautiful stuff done in this trilogy so far, and I'm so excited to see where the third book, A Walk in Shadow, takes us. Again, I cannot wait to make more videos specifically about Forge of Darkness and Fall of Light, and hopes and expectations, dreams for the third book. 4th place, Forge of Darkness. Woo! Top three, baby. Okay, in 3rd place, we have Midnight Tides, Book 5. I can't really say anything bad about this book. It's so good. I love the step back. Introduce us, sure, Erikson, I trust you. You've done it before. I trust you this time. Introduce us to a totally new cast of characters on the 5th book. New setting. Honestly, a lot of new kind of ideas to grapple with as well, that haven't been, even if they've been kind of peripheral to what's been happening in the other novels, they come to the forefront here. The City of Lethers is one of my favorite settings. Tahol and Bug are an amazing duo that I like here a lot, but I think they only get better from here in later books. And everything with the brothers in the Edor, the Taista Edor brothers, everything that's alluded to about lore and ancient history. Of course, some of that stuff is now being covered in the Witness Trilogy, but it's all so fascinating. Saren Padak, didn't like her at first when I was reading the series, or I at least thought that her sections were a little slower. In hindsight, I love everything she adds here. Everything with Briss and everything with the court politics. It's the most court politic heavy, I guess, up to this point. That we've gotten in the series. It's so good. And the final, there's a scene near the end, the throne room scene. It breaks my heart. It has my heart racing. I cried. I pumped my fists. I was so mad at how it worked out, but so engaged, and I enjoyed it in a way, and this book is so damn good, so darn good, so good. 3rd place. There's still 2 more to talk about, and I love that I'm just gushing about book 5, Midnight Tides. Okay, so now, and everything out of the frame that I've been stacking up is getting a little precarious. This is hard. Choosing between these two. For the longest time, it wasn't this way. The first time I read, it was probably this order. Then for the longest time, it was flipped. And now I think it's back a little bit. 2nd place. Untitled Hounds, Book 8 in Malazan Book 4. One of the most divisive books in the series. One of my favorites. I think it is the way it reads is so comfortable and so charming in a weird way. The fact that it's told from the particular sort of comedic perspective it's told from. However, the story itself deals with these really complicated questions of love and grief being the flip side of the same coin. And, just everything that this book covers, it's a massive one. They're all pretty darn big. Just one of, if not the longest, it's one of the longest, like 2 or 3. And the step back to Darujistan, to characters we haven't seen in some cases, 5 books. It's so good. It's sort of a breather. You kind of catch your breath, and before you know it, you're on this amazing roller coaster of emotions for the last 300 pages or so, and payoffs. Just the way that he pays off a lot of the more slow burn kind of build up here. It's so good. It's heart-wrenching, and I think I don't know. I get it. That's a good way to express how speechless this book can leave people. And I don't even want to say where certain climaxes happen. I don't want to give anything away about it, because it's so interesting. It's so creative. I will say that this novel really starts alluding to, even more than the 5th book did, this starts alluding to a lot of what will eventually be covered in the Witness Trilogy, and I think some of the themes being explored in that trilogy are sort of a carry-on of the conversation, maybe the Erikson, or the thought processes, and the arguments that he was maybe starting to put forward here. He sort of just continues those in the Witness Trilogy. I think here the fact that he was able to work that into the 8th book in a massive 10-book series is so impressive. Just from a technical writing standpoint, this book's impressive. All of the different characters that come back here and that get to cross over and interact in interactions we've been waiting for a while, or kind of hoping we might get. We do. Some of it's hilarious, some of it's tragic. An amazing book. For a while, I ranked this number 1, my favorite. But now, the more I think about the only one we haven't talked about, I think I have to give first place to Reaper's Gale, Book 7. And I think one of the biggest points in this book's favor is that pretty much everything that Book 5, which I gave 3rd place to, introduces, and a lot of the themes that are covered there, the storylines that are begun there, this book really takes a lot of that stuff to the next level. Even the humor, the specific brand of humor with a couple characters that starts in Book 5, in this one, you just really get even more of that. And in addition to all of that, Erikson is able to tie in more threads from the rest of the series. So not only does this function as what I think is an even better sequel to the 5th book, this is Book 7, the series structure is a little strange, to say the least, but not only is this a sequel to Book 5, I think it surpasses Book 5 in quality. This is also a sequel that does to Books 1, 2, 3, 4, and 6, that does so much to start bringing things to where we think the final conclusion of the series might eventually be. And everything that's covered here, even some of the unique storylines that are introduced in this book and just for this book, have amazing emotional payoffs here. The political kind of conversations are more interesting in this book, I think, than in the rest of the series. Everything with Red Mask, I wasn't the biggest fan of the first time through, but it has since grown on me. Everything with certain duels that are kind of essential to a certain emperor's power. Everything there, I really enjoy. I understand some people find this anticlimactic. What happens with that situation, I thought it was great. My eyes were glued to the page every step of the way. Let's take a moment of a character realizing the water levels are rising and what that means for people he's put in a certain place. Absolutely broke my heart, but the way Erikson delivered it, it was amazing. Let's take another moment of someone playing with, or of someone lighting candles. Very heartbreaking, hard to talk about this story, but so good, so good. Introduction of the Shake storyline, which I was intrigued by here, and I like where it goes in books 9 and 10. Just is a bit of a distraction from other things. Just how he pulled this massive book together, everything that's mashed in here, honestly, it's amazing to me that it's this short. It's not short at all, but it's amazing to me that this book holds so many of my favorite things about this series, and that's why it's number 1. So, there's my ranking of Malazan Book of the Fallen. I hope you enjoyed the video, and please hit the like and subscribe button if you're interested in seeing any more of my videos on this series or other fantasy series I've been reading. Thank you. Bye.